Okay, so I was watching a bit of the infamous Oliver McCall Lennox Lewis rematch for the WBC heavyweight title in 1997, February 97, almost exactly 20 years ago. And this rematch was notorious because of the mannerisms shown by Oliver McCall during the fight. Basically, he put his hands down, he walked away from his opponent, and at one point, I'm not sure which round it was, but he actually broke down and cried. Everyone was perplexed. The crowd booed. Referee Mills Lane was perplexed. He said, "Do you want to keep fighting? Do you want to keep fighting?" I think Lewis didn't really know what was going on. Lewis just kept up in fighting stance. And most obvious of all, McCall's trainers were very animated about it, saying, "Don't do this to yourself," and yelling at him, somewhere between pleading with him and yelling at him. Um, it's quite unsettling footage because, in a way, it's more painful to watch that than seeing a guy getting a punch to the face, because you can see that there's something clearly going wrong here. Now, Oliver McCall was a pretty decent fighter, 57-14-0, pretty decent record, and he beat Lennox Lewis, one of only two men that did. Lewis won this actually by default because McCall was in no fit state, excuse me, to continue. I wonder would the outcome have been different if his mental state had been different. No way to know. And by the way, I'm a big Lennox Lewis fan, but Oliver McCall strikes me as one of those guys who was sort of the nearly men. A very talented fighter, but a patched record. Nevertheless, no pushover. Clearly, something was going on here. Now, this is important when I said he was no pushover because you could sort of understand if it was a first-time fighter and it was someone who wasn't used to this sport and they realized too late, oh, this isn't for me. What have I got myself into? But Oliver McCall was a seasoned fighter. He'd been in many professional fights before. So you have to wonder what exactly happened there. I've never seen any interviews, incidentally, about what may have went on. McCall didn't retire after that. He had a number of fights afterwards with mixed record. But clearly, at some point in that bout, he had a breakdown. Maybe he didn't want the rematch. Maybe he thought, well, I've done this, I've achieved this. Why should I go for the rematch? And maybe a confidence suddenly plummeted, and that can get the better of a fighter. But it's very rare that I've seen something like that, and I've seen that video a few times now, and it makes me wonder: should there be psychological assessments in the sport of boxing, not just physical assessments, but psychological assessments? With some of the tragedies that happened last year, there was a lot of talk about improving the physical assessment before bouts, with the tragedy involving Mike Tyle and others. And that's very important. I absolutely agree that there needs to be an absolutely concrete physical assessment before professional bouts. I would make that mandatory, in fact. Um, but the physical side is only one side of it. You could have a fighter who is in perfect physical health. Now, there appeared to be nothing wrong with Oliver McCall physically. He looked toned, he looked in perfect physical health. And as far as I know, that he didn't suffer a concussion or anything like that. So I really believe that the psychological side of it is a big factor. This is a famous example, but there's many examples of boxers losing it outside the ring. So it isn't just an in-ring thing. This case is quite well known because it happened in the ring. But the number of boxers that have ended up kind of becoming unraveled, whether it be resorting to alcoholism or resorting to domestic violence or other issues. Of course, this is not to say that it's unique in boxing, far from it. But there is, I think, in all honesty, quite a high level of these sort of things within the sport of boxing. That is to say, fighters collapsing psychologically. Um, in the UK, there's been many examples going way, way back. Benny Lynch in Scotland is one example. In the US, Jake LaMotta, of course, Raging Bull was based around his turbulent private life. Um, so then it's kind of like, did the chicken or the egg come first? Does boxing cause it, or is it actually a lack of stability within the sport of boxing that causes these guys to go off the rails? Now, in the case of Oliver McCall, it happened within the ring, but with other fighters, it happens outside the ring. And very often for fighters, it's the only thing they know. So when they retire, sometimes things don't go quite smoothly. Now, it's very important that people like me, i.e., fans of the sport, don't kind of slander the sport and say that this is a result of boxing, because I do thoroughly believe that boxing can save a lot of young men from a life of crime. I do believe that. And there's many proven examples of that, where fighters who would have ended up just as another thug on the street ended up as professional champions. I mean, George Foreman is a real success story. He would have been just another thug on the street. He got into the world of boxing. He ended up as a widely admired heavyweight champion. Um, and there's other examples. Bernard Hopkins, I believe Roy Jones Jr. unless I'm mistaken, they all came from rough scrabble backgrounds, and this can be found throughout boxing history. But because the sport is so tough, so demanding, so physically tough, um, I do wonder should there be psychological tests, something similar to the sort of discussion that goes around service personnel suffering from post traumatic stress disorder. That might sound like a drastic comparison, and there's obvious differences. Boxers don't intend to kill each other, and boxing is a sport whereas soldiers are in a war zone, but it is a very tough sport and it is a dangerous sport. Um, and there's a whole range of things that can create, in my opinion, that sort of psychological stress for a fighter. Say you have a fighter who's been on a winning streak and then he loses a fight. That's obviously going to have some impact. Say you have issues going on outside the ring that then play out, and let's say a fighter is knocked out in front of his girlfriend or his wife. There's a lot of things that go on in this sport that, if a fighter is not prepared mentally, can really get to them. And that's nothing to do with weakness. There shouldn't be a stigma about, well, a fighter's weak if they have this psychological reaction. Incidentally, I mentioned that the Oliver McCall incident is rare. I'm not sure if it could be applied to the Andrew Gallotta incident in his fight with Tyson. I think that was more to do with the physical aspect. That is to say, I think Gallotta genuinely feared that he was going to have long term physical ailments, although there was a bit of psychology involved in that as well. So, in my opinion, there needs to be a lot more devoted to this side of the sport. Um, Obviously, no one forces fighters to fight, but I do think that when a fighter goes into the ring, he or she should go through an assessment. Are they happy? It sounds like a basic question, but are they happy? Because I think if a fighter is in the sport through a negative energy, then at some point that's going to boil over in a very bad way, whether it be fighting dirty, um, continuously breaking rules because they aren't giving themselves discipline, or whether it be an in ring breakdown like what Oliver McCall had. Clearly, what Oliver McCall was going through in that fight was not a guy who loved boxing. That was a man who was going through serious psychological stress for whatever reason. And it's hard to say why, because the fight wasn't entirely one-sided up to that point. It's not like he was being badly beaten. He was probably being beaten, but it wasn't like, he was getting pulverized. Oliver McCall is a very decent fighter, as far, in my opinion. I don't think this was a case of a huge dirt match fighter, but he had a breakdown, and I do wonder, is it sometimes the case that the publicity side of things, all the hype and all the business side of it, sometimes neglects the fact that boxers are human beings? Sometimes, as fans and promoters also overlook this. I think there is this tendency to see fighters as kind of like characters in a computer game. People forget they're human beings. So, no matter how tough a guy is physically, everyone can be fragile mentally. Everyone. So I do believe maybe it is necessary to have psychological tests before bouts. Check if the fighter is happy with the situation. Do they want to fight? Of course, it becomes a difficult thing then because there is a large amount of ego involved. And when you're being paid large amounts of money and you've signed contracts and you've got thousands of fans, any sort of notion of discomfort, a fighter is going to dismiss that and bury that. But maybe it's better that he talks it through. If I was a trainer and I was training a guy and I thought there's something wrong with this guy, he's stressed, his mind isn't in the right place, what I would do is deal with that before anything else. I would say, look, we need to work through this to a place where you're happy. Then we'll get into all the regular training. And that might sound like psychobabble nonsense, but I really do think this is very, very important. I've only had one fight, amateur level, hardly comparable to what these guys go through. But I know that I was under a certain amount of pressure not to let myself down. Now, I lost a fight, and admittedly, that has played on my mind ever since. I'm fine with it. I'm pleased I've done it, but I didn't want to lose, and it's not a good feeling losing. And that was just amateur level. So I can imagine the impact losing a big fight would have. In this case, he lost by default. But I can imagine, like I said, a guy who's had a winning streak and then he loses. I really, really do believe it is necessary that boxers in those circumstances are really given given a space to work through it, and they need support. So I'm not a big fan of this thing of shoving cameras in a fighter's face just seconds after he's been defeated. Not a big fan of that. It's a bit like shoving a camera in a politician's face after he or she has lost your seat. There's a certain abruptness to that. I don't like it. So let me know your thoughts. Obviously, boxing fans will be interested in this video, but it applies to anyone. Do you think, not just in boxing, but in other martial arts, should fighters be given perhaps psychological assessments? Because although this sport can provide stability and discipline, and it can be a very positive thing, if things go wrong for a fighter, it can then become a very negative thing. And when you have a sport that is a combat sport, that is a sport of aggression, and their mind is in the wrong place, then it's like hell. I mean, that's something that really, really, I really believe that in professional level, even if it's not a title fight, any professional fight, any fight for that matter, there needs to be a certainty that the fighter is in the right place psychologically. Now, in my case, I lost the fight, and yeah, that bothered me. But I also enjoyed the night. I'm pleased I'd done it. And I know my mind was in the right place because I was looking forward to it. And I'm happy I'd done it. But I've no guarantee that that would have went another way. I could have really, really let that get to me. It bothered me a bit, still does. But I know well there's always another day. But at professional level, when I'm making money for it, when it's a livelihood, when there's ego at stake, when I've got fans, that could be a different matter. So, and this is yet another reason why real fans should respect fighters. So it really, I'm not going to repeat things I've said before, but suffice to say, I think if you're a real fan of this sport, you appreciate what fighters put themselves through, not just in the ring, but all the training outside it. So, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.